The purpose of today's class, as a continuation of the topic we've been discussing about the redemption that's at hand, is that we need to wake ourselves up a little bit. As much as it's true that there are problems and challenges and struggles and difficulties and poverty and hunger and illness that still exists, the progress, the advancement are indications that we're getting closer to the times of the coming of Mashiach. And that is something important that I don't want us to neglect and forget. So I thought it's appropriate that we start off today with Wake Up Yidden. It's a song we used to sing as kids, as you saw the video in front of the Rebbe. It was a camp song that was composed, but the Rebbe very much enjoyed the theme as it was sung in his presence. Wake up Yidden from this dream of Gullus. We're too used to the darkness. We're too used to the hardships, the difficulties, the struggles, and the challenges that it's hard for us to wake up to see. It sounds too fantastical that indeed it could be a better world ahead. We have a hard time believing it because right here in our own community we see the hardships, we see the poverty, we see the problems, and we don't want to believe it. Now again, some might call me naive, that I do believe it. I'm trying to wake us up. So whether these statistics are accurate or not, the point is that we're certainly
I'm
progressing.
not
And the solutions
making
are
meat
much
tonight
closer
because
to
I
us today
haven't
than they
taken
ever
any
were
meat
before.
out. I
As we
haven't had a
discussed,
chance.
perhaps
So I've taken out my
redistribution
fish.
of
What are you
not
going to
of
eat? The
wealth, because that I don't
fish
believe,
cakes.
that's
Now,
coming.
the only thing is I've
But
got to get severed.
if the rich would be more charitable, if there would be less waste, if there would be less corruption in government and things like that, we could solve a lot more of the problems.
Are you not well enough to go and collect?
That's the reality that I want us to wake up to. There's a great story I heard
No,
in my
depends on how you feel.
while sharing as well of a family that once they couldn't pay their
And
rent.
even lunch.
Back in the day in Eastern Europe, there would be these landlords. They would call them aporitz. You ever heard of aporitz? Aporitz was this very wealthy Russian or Polish or Ukrainian or Belarusian landlord, in the Eastern European countries. And they would own swaths of land. And the Jews who lived there had to pay rent. In fact, lots of Jews were in the hotel business in those days. I don't know about here in South Africa, although I know there were many Jewish-owned hotels here in South Africa as well. But in Europe, many Jews were in the hotel industry. It was one of those businesses you paid rent to your landlord. If you were lucky to do well, then you had a good business. If not, and you didn't pay, then they had very harsh punishments. And sometimes they would take a family and throw them into a prison cell. And the story goes, I'm sure this one's only a mashal, a metaphor, but the parable story is that this particular family owed a lot of money to the pirates and they couldn't pay up. So the pirates threw the family into a dungeon. And then they were joined by another Jewish family. And they're there for so long before they know it, they don't know the outside world life. And the kids start to marry into each other because it's two Jewish families sitting in a dungeon. And every day they just get a little bit of bread and water that's dropped into them. And otherwise, they don't know of another life outside of this dungeon cell. And you can imagine it's happening now, a few generations of the family all growing up in this dungeon. And one day, one of the second generation inmates, or whatever you call the people in the dungeon, prisoners, says to his kids, my great-grandfather told me that there's a world out there where there's sunshine. And there's a world out there where there's oceans and birds and animal life and other food besides for this bread and water that we get every day. And they don't believe it. Why don't they believe it? Well, just like our ancestors in Egypt didn't believe Moshe when he said to them that better days are coming, that redemption is at hand. And the purpose, the idea of this metaphor is illustrating that sometimes we also struggle with that belief. Really, a better world could come, but we see so much poverty, we see so much hunger, we see so many problems in the world. It's impossible. Well, yesterday we talked about how the medical advancements, I'm going to fast forward from there. Let's talk today about other problems. Today, Ukraine celebrates its independence. I think they want independence again. And I think while on the one hand, probably one of the most famous prophecies that we know about the coming of Mashiach is Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. You familiar with that one? The prophet Isaiah tells us, nation shall not lift sword against nation. The whole world will know of war anymore. Don't you know that? They used to sing it in Israel. No Israelis here. We'll wait for Ronnie to come. Maybe he'll sing it. Lo yisa goel go cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. That no nation will lift the sword up against another nation, and the world should not train for war anymore. Now that certainly sounds fantastical to us, doesn't it? How could that be possible? By the way, this prophecy is emblazoned on the wall outside the United Nations building in New York City. So it's certainly not just a Jewish belief. The nations of the world also are familiar with our prophecies. Oftentimes we Jews are the most skeptical of our own prophets. Sometimes we have a harder time with our teachings than we ourselves do. The prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu Hanavi, proclaimed this grandiose prophecy more than 2,500 years ago, at a time when civilization largely glorified, they lauded war and conquest then. You think about the figures in history from Alexander the Great and the various conquerors of the world. In ancient societies such as Greece and Rome, the heroic warriors, the fighters, were the ones who were celebrated and praised and worshipped and lauded and seen as the greatest. Great works of literature by Homer, for example, are epics relating the bravery and exploits. War and hostilities were a regular part of life. And the truth is, while it still exists, I feel much safer today. Then again, I have cousins who had to escape their home in Ukraine. So while we might feel safe here, we know it still exists. But in my childhood, I can't think, it's certainly, let's say this, my father grew up with war in a war zone, and wars are still around. There was a time, though, that it was virtually impossible to envision a life that wasn't like that. And there is a part of me that says we can at least fantasize of it. Personally, I believe that until Mashiach comes, ain't gonna happen. Right? Because unfortunately, there are countries that make a living off war. Okay, I don't want to get political here. I'll stick away from that and conspiracy theories. But Judaism always despised war. We always despised war. We saw war as something to be avoided. As we spoke on Monday about the bee versus, about the bee and the honey. Remember? Israel's perspective, Israel does not want war, okay? And Judaism does not tell us that war is not allowed, okay? There are certain people who advocate for pacifism, which says that war is unjustifiable under all circumstances. That is not the Jewish perspective. People who held such views, they refused to even fight the Nazis, right? Because war should be avoided at all costs. That's nonsense, of course. Judaism rejects that approach. Our aspiration is a world with no war. But in the flawed world of today that we live in, wars, and including preemptive strikes, which we know Israel did just a few weeks ago, are sometimes necessary for self-defense. And the metaphor I gave the other day was the Torah tells us that the land of Israel is Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey. We talked about the significance of milk on Monday, so I won't rehash it, but it's the symbolism of chesed, of loving kindness. I want to just touch on the honey part. Since I told you the reason we have to wake up, I forgot already the second reason. Didn't remind me. The second reason we have to wake up, traditionally, as the month of Elul comes, as it's going to be Friday night, is Rosh Chodesh. Elul is a time we have to wake up. We're told HaMelech Basad, that the king is in the field. We need to wake up from our slumber, from our laziness, from whatever it is that holds us back from achieving It's a month of preparation for the high holidays. In fact, the good acronym for it is CPR. It's a time of resuscitation. Charity, prayer, and repentance, our sages tell us. CPR is the way to avert any harsh decrees. So since Rosh Chodesh Elul is upon us now, that means Rosh Hashanah is just a month away from this coming Sunday. So it's certainly a time for us to get a little bit more into the mode, into the zone of the high holidays. Wake up! I used to hear about, when I went to camp as a kid, they would have a vecker. You know what a vecker was? Somebody would wake you up in the morning and say, it's time to serve the Creator. So we need sometimes the vecker inside ourselves. That's what we're here for. We're going to blow the shofar starting on Sunday because the shofar show good. But if good isn't better. So we need to improve. We want to become, and the word shofar also means to improve, right? So we want to improve ourselves. We want to shine. We want to refine ourselves. We want to be better. That's, after all, the purpose of blowing the shofar. It's a wake-up call. Judaism tells us, of course, we don't want more. And in the idyllic world of Mashiach, there won't be more. I think Israel, listen, I don't want to sound like an anti-Semite, an anti-Zionist, God forbid, I'm not. But it's not that Israel's perfect, and no country's perfect, and no person's perfect. There's no doubt that Israel has its flaws just like any other country. But Natan Sharansky, I think it was him, he once created the test to know if somebody who criticizes Israel is doing so out of genuine care and concern. Any citizen of any country should be able to criticize its government, or if it is anti-Semitism, which unfortunately most of Israel's critics are anti-Semites, including Jewish critics of Israel. They don't even realize that they're being anti-Semitic. And the test he gave, which I don't remember the exact details of, maybe I could just quickly look for it to put it up here for you. I think it's Natan Sharansky's test of, I don't know, what would you call it? What would you give it? I don't know, I'd have to just find the correct name for it. Either way, the point he says is that if it is, I think it's 3 Ds of anti-Semitism. That if you're discriminating only against the Jewish country, something like that, to that, the 3D test. Okay, here, I'll quickly Google it and see if it comes up. Delegitimization, demonization, double standards. Those are the 3 Ds. If you're delegitimizing the Jewish state, meaning your purpose is not to criticize a particular policy of the government, then he says, no, that's anti-Semitism. If it's demonization, and of course if it's a double standard, people who are silent on human abuses around the world, not only Israel they find the problems with, then you know what the source is, and we don't have to discuss it any further. But the point I'm making here is that the Torah tells us the land of Israel is a land flowing with milk and honey. We describe the milk as the kindness. Israel certainly shares wisdom, intelligence, so much with the world. And the bee test, when we were kids, our parents told us when the bee was flying around, don't bother the bee and it won't sting you. Okay, if you bother it, you get in its way, then very likely you'll get stung. Israel gives honey like a bee, and Israel's not interested in wars with countries for no reason. Sometimes, like the bee, it has to preemptively strike or defend itself when Israel knows that it is under threat. That's precisely what Israel had to do just a few weeks ago. But I think that is a symbolism of Israel in some ways, is that Israel's not out to sting. Israel is to give honey like a bee. But at the same time, it could also sting if it is threatened. And throughout our history, Jews had to resort to war, whether it was to conquer the land of Israel as we were instructed by Hashem. And in all wars, even with the 7 nations that are mentioned in the Torah, and Amalek, the enemy was given the opportunity to make peace. And if they did so, they would not be killed. If you made peace, you wouldn't be killed. So the point is that Torah and Judaism do not glorify war. We don't consider war ideal. In fact, as the prophets tell us, which is what we are analyzing today, war is something that our prophets told us will be no more. What was the song at the beginning? There will be no more wars, no more will lions roar. So no more war, imagine that. And if that was something that could happen in our lifetime, wouldn't we be so lucky? Of course, there are too many wars. Like I said, my own family is displaced from their home in Ukraine. With a name like Kiev, man, you can imagine, I got family there. And I do. My cousins who lived in a city called Kharkiv, they're in America now. I don't know which other more distant relatives. That's my father's first cousin who lives in Kharkiv. Now he's in America, unfortunately. So the point is that it exists, and it's here. And there are still serious threats of war, and there are various rogue states, and there's ISIS next door to us in Mozambique. They announced their presence. They let us know they're here. I'm sure there's what to fear with knowing that ISIS is around the corner from us. That's certainly not pleasant, right? David HaMelech, King David, who took part in many wars. And because of that, he was unworthy of building the Beis HaMikdash. Did you know that? That's why his son had to. It's discussed in the book in Divrei Yamim, in Chronicles. Because of the lives that he took in battle, he was unable to build the temple. In every other culture, King David's military prowess would have made him the ideal person to build a temple. Look at him. What a hero. But in Jewish culture, that was a disqualification because of his involvement in wars. As justified as those wars were, King David couldn't build the temple because of his involvement with war. And it's interesting that there's various halachic elements, implications. You know that you're not allowed to wear a weapon on Shabbos, halachically speaking. Of course, the exception would be unless one is in a situation of pikuach nefesh. When it comes to lives at risk, purposes of saving lives, that's a different story. But the reason given in the Mishnah 2,000 years ago, when the Jews experienced 1,800 years ago, when the temple was destroyed, and Jews knew war, unfortunately, very well after experiencing horrible persecutions. The reason explained is that a weapon is not considered an ornament because they are essentially abhorrent. It's for the ultimate goal in halacha is for a time for no war and no weapons, and therefore, unless you have a life-threatening situation at hand, halacha forbids the use of carrying a weapon. Today, I got to tell you, I can show you a video of a new designed kapata. You know the kapata I wear on Shabbos? The long cloak? So there's a newly designed kapata that, in fact, is able to carry your gun very well inside it. And it's fake buttons in the front. So it's really, what do you call those clip-on buttons? Not the ones, mine is actual buttons like my shirt here that you have to open and close. It's much harder. In case, what's that? Yeah. So in case of an emergency, God forbid, you just pull it open. CSO. We'll have some more people involved in the CSO and community security services here with this new kapata. It's wonderful to see this kapata. The Jewish perspective is not that we should be carrying weapons, and that's why halacha forbids us to even carry a gun on Shabbos. Now, obviously, understandably, if we live in South Africa, and unfortunately crime is high here, as is poverty and hunger and all the other and many other problems, well, then halachically you would be allowed to carry a weapon if you know how to use it safely, etc., to save lives. By the way, the 20th century saw, I don't know, okay, I'm not speaking historically, but I think I once heard this, that there was more bloodshed during the two world wars than probably throughout history. I don't think any war in history saw as many deaths as did the First and Second World Wars. Is that accurate? Has anyone heard such a thing? You think so? I've heard such a thing. And in fact, I have a figure here that state-based battle-related deaths globally, 100,000, 1946 to 2016. You see how the numbers have dropped. But of course, um, wars, unfortunately, are a reality in the world. And we should be aspiring to a better time. Maybe even more important than the number of battle deaths is the attitude that people and nations have about war. And this includes civil war conflicts and conflicts between governments and states. Okay, there's so much, I think, an attitude today of not just acceptance, but endorsement, promotion. Since the dawn of time, war and conquest were the norm. No one batted an eye when Alexander the Great and, I don't know, Napoleon and other, you guys are more familiar than I am with all the personalities, engaged in conquest. It was the norm, right? They wanted to increase their power, their might, and that was normal, that was acceptable. Today, it is universally agreed that such behavior is reprehensible. Today, attitudes have changed. The United Nations Charter declares all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Now, halavai, that would be supported properly, but just to think about that. Unfortunately, politics plays its role, and that's why this very country supports Russia and its war. Think about that. Why is South Africa taking the wrong side? Politics. Also, I mean, there's a lot of dynamics at play, is that democracies really go to war with each other. Do you see that much? How many democracies have gone to war with each other? No, exactly. So again, we're seeing, there's no doubt there's still war, but I'm painting a picture, an imagery that certainly today the attitude towards war has diminished, or at least we don't see it as something noble to look forward to. And I think that's certainly a good sign. I want to, in fact, read you an article about this called War Really is Going Out of Style. And here it goes. Armed conflict hasn't vanished, and today anyone with a mobile phone can broadcast the bloodshed. But our impressions of the prevalence of war, stoked by these images, can be misleading. For centuries, wars reallocated huge territories as empires were agglomerated or dismantled and states wiped off the map. But since shortly after World War II, virtually no borders have changed by force, and no members of the United Nations have disappeared through conquest. So, there's more here. Perhaps the deepest cause of waning war is a growing repugnance towards institutionalized violence. Brutal customs that were commonplace for millennia have been largely abolished. Cannibalism, I told you, in the early 1940s, my uncle was nearly cannibalized. Thank God he was rescued. But today we don't hear much of that. Human sacrifice, mention it here, but infanticide, that was very common once upon a time. It's not mentioned in the article, but just knowing a little bit of history. We don't hear that much about human sacrifice. We do hear about, what is that called? And they do that in some Arab countries where I'm forgetting the deaths, where the way they murder, someone who's a cherem, somebody who's a real outcast, and they want to make a public demonstration of that. But heretic burning, that was what once upon a time very common. Slavery still exists in parts of the world, but much less than it was. It was once commonplace everywhere. Punitive mutilation. sadistic executions. These are all listed in the article, which it's not that they don't exist, but he concludes saying, could war really be going the way of slave auctions? I don't think so, in my opinion. But I certainly do think that we're in a better place than we were, at least in the attitude that most of us have. So if we think about this, no longer does war abolish nations, and instead nations seem intent on abolishing war. Not perfect, I know. Just turn on your radio, put on your TV, you'll see. But back then, Alexander the Great, would those great conquerors be alive today? Would they perhaps be standing before the world court in The Hague and sentenced to life behind bars? Would they be seen as pariahs like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi and others? Osama bin Laden? So while it's not gone and it's not perfect, well, I guess maybe that's where Putin should be. That's perhaps Putin. I don't know. I don't want to get caught up in that. But certainly Russia has a lot more condemnation for what it's doing today. Since, in the past, I don't know, they probably would have easily gotten away with it and we would have known. So why are wars, let's call it in decline, while they're still happening, they're in decline? Or at least public opinion is against it. No? Don't we see it as more immoral, as reprehensible? Now, this should never have been something tolerable. It should always have been unthinkable. But for most of human history, people engaged in war, even if it still exists. Now, what happened? Why are people's attitudes, opinions changed? Why today do we call a spade a spade? Maybe, just maybe. Maybe means we are one step closer to redemption. Maybe. That's what I want to leave it at. Maybe we're one step closer. Other nan. I'm not saying that it is, but perhaps. Yes. Go for it. It's after all. Even if it isn't, the fact that we have democracies today, by the way, democracy is not necessarily the Torah's way, but I do think it's probably the best option of government that exists out there, even if it's also not the forefront.
Tomorrow.
But I think
No one.
today, the global attitude is better than it previously was. That's all. Not to say that it doesn't exist, that there's still problems. There's lots of it. And not only that, as part of the improvement in the area of war and peace, which, again, the only solution is Mashiach, but there does exist a reduction, an improvement in weaponry. Certainly, I think there's a lot more precision artillery that is created to minimize casualties, at least by those who reprehend war and want to only take Israel as an example. While Israel does engage in wars, Israel's goal is not to bomb innocent men, women, and children, but to take out real targets, to assassinate those who are instigators of war. And so look at the type of weaponry that Israel was so instrumental in creating and engineering. What's the word for it? Promoting. I mean, you look at the I'm looking for another word. Anyways, if you look at what? Pardon? Look at the Iron Dome as an example. If Iron Dome did not exist in the past few wars that Israel fought, the casualties on the Israel side would have been who knows how much more. Because our enemy just shoots indiscriminately into Israel. It's thanks to Iron Dome that we have today and what Israel itself uses. Again, it's not perfect. We saw an instance the other week where there were casualties. 5 children died from a missile that Israel launched to take out a precision missile. But unfortunately, there are casualties. Sadly, that's part of the cost of war. When I used to see the Rebbe speaking, you could watch the videos of the Rebbe talking about his opinions in the Middle East, and the Rebbe was very against any concession of territory.
Cruise numbers.
Rebbe always emphasized both sides. He said that we don't want deaths on either side. And the Rebbe maintained that for the security of Israel, for the welfare of the Jewish residents, we shouldn't compromise on any. There should be no territorial, not to give away any land. That was the Rebbe's perspective. Either way, I want to point out this. Okay, look at this headline here. China reassigning 60,000 soldiers to plant trees in a bid to fight.
It still does this.
I mean,
This doesn't all the time. It's turning around.
Using weapons
Are you listening to one? No matter what you do. No, you've got to do this one.
In the ancient past, soldiers fought with spears, knives, and
This one
arrows,
here.
which would kill only a limited number of people, and only from a relatively close range. With time, we got more skillful at killing. We developed rifles, cannon fire, artillery. Then we got even better at the art of killing. We built fighter planes, intercontinental ballistic missile systems, even nuclear bombs. You watched the video the other week we showed about Alfred Nobel. You know what he did for a living? We know his reputation today as the Nobel Peace Prizes. But what did he do for a living? Do you know? Dynamite. Probably brought a lot more devastation to the world. No wonder why he really wanted to change his reputation, his legacy. During the Cold War, it seemed as if the world would explode. I mean, we had atomic energy. Who knows what that could have led to? The arms race. Think about what it could have led to. And yet, an amazing thing happened in 1991, and I'm mentioning this specifically because the Rebbe did. Whether conditions have improved or gotten worse since then could be a separate discussion. But you think about it, in 91, the U.S. and Russia entered into Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, where the idea was to decommission their nuclear arsenal. Even here in South Africa, where there is a nuclear reactor or whatever there is here, I don't even know if it's in use anymore, is it? It is. Okay. Do the people who know how to use it? That's a separate question. But the truth is, since then, thousands of nuclear missiles have been decommissioned. So the idea then, of course, is that there are good intentions going on. As recent as by 2016, 85% of the nuclear warheads that were extant in 1986, 20 years prior, were decommissioned. Last year, when the current New START treaty between Russia and the U.S. was discussed, I don't know exactly where it's holding, they said the U.S. and Russia will be 6% of what they once were, if you could believe the Russians, that is. But the fact is that the world at least realizes, and there's a lot of discussion about, moving things in the right direction. Now, obviously, there have been setbacks. No doubt, Russia itself is at fault for much of the setbacks. Now that governments aren't waging nearly as many wars as they used to what are they devoting their military resources? South Africa has an army. I don't know how useful it is, but what does the army here do? The last I've seen this army do was during COVID, enforce the lockdown. But it was also distributing food. It was also doing a lot of good things. And let's put South Africa aside. Let's think about other governments. In 2018, Thailand used most of its elite air force to rescue junior soccer team that clung to life for 18 hours in a flooded cave. And although I didn't see the movie, I was told that there's a Netflix film about the story. Have any of you seen it? 2018, there was a flood in a cave in Thailand, and they had to bring very, very sophisticated, advanced military personnel to save the soccer team who were stuck in this cave. It was maybe a tsunami. I don't know what it was. They could have died. What they did, as far as what I heard, what I heard they did was they went inside. They actually gave them some kind of drug to put them into a sedated position, sedated them. Then they put oxygen masks on them and carried them back through the water. This is the military. And it, again, using the military not to fight a war, but to save lives. When the tsunami hit Indonesia in 2004, you remember that? There were remote areas that cannot be reached, and relief workers cannot ascertain the nature or extent of the damage. The United States tapped into its military personnel, the spy satellites that they use, and they were able to establish a map of where aid was needed and to map out a road system for aid workers to follow. And the same thing happened in the U.S. when there was a hurricane. Remember Hurricane Katrina? And there were other hurricanes, and there were earthquakes in Haiti. And Israel was very involved in these. You know how much Israel has done when these situations have happened? There's a gentleman who davens at the Ahmed every day at Torah Academy. Both his parents died a year ago, just about a year ago, in a terrible tragedy. They went to sleep at night, not knowing what the noise in the background was. But the next morning, their building collapsed. A mostly Jewish residents in that building, by the way. In Miami. Their son lives here in Johannesburg and says Kaddish for his parents every day at Torah Academy. And to just think, but why am I mentioning this? Because Israel and the U.S. used a lot of its military personnel to be there, to be present, to help with the relief effort. Throughout COVID, I was talking about here in South Africa, but all over the world, there were soldiers, there were sailors, there were airmen who were dispatched to help with the COVID response, so helping people. So we think about that militaries are being used not for the original intent of fighting wars, but saving lives, combating pollution. You know, like you saw in this headline here. You know, there's many situations, and we could list a million examples. Crisis after crisis, militaries have used their awesome might, their capabilities that were developed for what purpose? For war. But instead, were being used for humanitarian purposes. Is that not what our prophets told us? Turning swords into what do they call plowshares? And this fact has now become commonplace that it's no longer surprising for us to hear it because it's become so common. Today we take it for granted. But, I don't know, a century ago, who would have thought the military is coming to save lives? Militaries have to fight wars. Many countries, in fact, call their armies defense. It's not only Israel Defense Forces. Many countries call their army the defense force. Because hopefully a military should only be for that purpose, to defend its citizens, not to fight wars. Again, I'm going to go back to the beginning. There's absolutely still lots of wars going on. There's still plenty of weapons in the world, and right here in this country, and right here in this city, 2 days, Sunday evening, one of my congregants, the whole family was robbed by 5 assailants. My young man wound up in hospital, stabbed in his back and his leg. I saw him yesterday, badly bruised. There's still plenty of problems in this very same place. And we can argue, are they doing so because they're impoverished or because they're hungry? Is it opportunist? I don't think there's any justification. You can't justify stabbing and stealing because you're hungry. But there's no doubt there's plenty of problems in the community, out of the community, all over the world, right? There's many threats. There's wars. There's lots of destruction. There's no doubt. I agree. Security here is sadly far from rectified. Far from it. We have members of this very shir who were carjacked a few weeks ago, but it wasn't on the day of the shir. Maybe because we didn't have a shir that day. I'm just kidding, God forbid. But sadly, the fact is that it happens. But that doesn't change the fact that we are living in the most peaceful era in all of history. And we can look forward to continued progress. And that's the point I'm making. And it goes back to last week's argument. We're definitely living in a more prosperous era than ever before. Don't shoot me, please. Because poverty and famine and hunger and war and all these problems, the solutions are all here today. Not that they're all being implemented. We need to implement them. But certainly we're living, and we talk about this violence that exists. It's here. But let's talk about what our prophets tell us about this. Let's see what our prophets tell us. And while it looks doom and gloom, particularly because this is the country where it's all at. Whereas in America, they could say poverty is not eliminated, but much less. In America, they could say you probably don't have people going hungry. There's no reason to see people going hungry because there are homeless shelters, there are soup kitchens. Here, we see the realities otherwise. This has to do with corruption in government and violence and crime right here. You know, when I used to do a lot more Hatzalah duty than I do now, I mean, I'm still on the roster and I do my duties, but I used to be a lot more involved. New Year's was a great time to be at Joburg Jen, Baruch Rana, Helen Joseph, and I'd meet international medical students who would take a break from their medical studies in their countries of origin because they knew that right here you get a lot more gunshots and all types of action that a paramedic wants to see, that a doctor wants to see in Joburg. You know, so we live in the epicenter of the world's crime, violence, and all that. But let's just take a zoom out. Not just, you know, why are we seeing the poverty why is it hard for us to relate to the numbers of the UN and these statistics? Because we live in the epicenter of it. So we see the poverty in our streets. We see the crime in our streets. But if we were to take a zoom out for a second, okay, zoom out. Look at the world as a whole, not just here. Have we improved in this area, in all these areas, compared to ancient societies? Let's talk specifically about crime. I know crime, no one can tell us about crime improving in Joburg. It's probably gotten worse. But what about the rest of the world? I will quote to you a criminologist. You ever heard of such a term, a criminologist? I would think a criminologist is a real expert at crime. But I guess it is an expert at crime, but just not the perpetrator of it. A criminologist from the University of Cambridge constructed a basic outline of violence levels across Europe during the past 800 years by assembling hundreds of homicide records that they have. Okay? Every country that he analyzed saw murder rates decline steeply over the centuries. So let's put it up here. A real decline in violence. I know, not locally, true, but around the world. Look at those numbers. Look at those figures. You want to go see the source for it? You go to ourworlddata.org. That's where this comes from. Our World Data. On Our World Data, you can get a lot of facts. Okay, maybe there's debate about facts, but they say you're entitled to your opinion, not to your facts. So at least the criminologist, he recorded these facts. One could debate, but it's a steep decline. Yes, ma'am. No, this was only Europe. So it says Italy, Scandinavia. If you look at this, you can't, probably nobody can see it too well. Italy, Scandinavia, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland, and England. Okay. You know, they what's that? Yeah. No more Jack the Rippers, no more of those. No doubt. You want to bring Mexico, there's drug lords. You want to come right here to Joburg. I'm taking Joburg out of the picture. The whole picture changes when you stick South Africa in, But the point is, England, for example, went from the estimated 24 homicides per 100,000 people in the 14th century to 0.6 homicides per 100,000 people by the early 1960s. In Italy, where the mobs come from, I know a Jewish mafia in New York. You know what they call themselves? The Bakery Boys. You know why? Because in Hebrew, the Hebrew word mafia means bakery or baker. So they call them the Bakery Boys. You had Jewish mobsters too. You ever heard of Meyer Lansky or Bugsy Siegel? And if you read the media in Joburg, I don't know if any of you saw it. Maybe it will be in the Jewish Report tonight. But there's this week an Israeli mafioso from South Africa was arrested this week. I know. Well, we know stories. Okay? But in Italy, as an example, the numbers are even more drastic. Look at the screen. From approximately 73 homicides per 100,000 in 1450, it's down to 0.9 in 2016. All right? How about more recent history? Are we progressing or regressing? Incredibly, since the 1990s, violent crime in first world countries has declined by more than 50%. Again, we have to take South Africa out of this picture, sadly, because I wouldn't be painting the same picture if I was using South Africa. Sadly so, yeah. No, I'm not excluding them, including the shooting incidents at American schools, which are on the rise. And unfortunately, they've been on the rise throughout. Maybe that's why Europe has got a better picture than the U.S. Probably gun rights there are more restrictive. But even with that, there's a major decline compared to the past. We're not there yet. Mashiach hasn't come yet. The world is not healed of its problems yet. But certainly, the situation, you can read this article here on the screen in 2019. According to a survey conducted by Gallup, about 64% of Americans believed that there was more crime in the U.S. than there was a year prior. It's a belief that we've consistently held for decades that crime is on the rise. But statistics tell us otherwise. And I believe the statistics because at least in first world countries, you can't really bluff the statistics. There's too much, surveillance and analysis, and you can't bluff those. Maybe you could, I don't know. But crime rates do fluctuate. That's true. And from year to year, 2020, for example, murder has been up in the U.S. But other crimes are on the decline. We can't just take one isolated year or two isolated years. That's why you're looking at it in a more broader picture, and you see that there's definitely a decline. Are we near perfection? No. The point, that's not the picture I'm even trying to in any way paint. But I am trying to tell you that there are improvements throughout history, things that are getting better. Okay, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to maybe look at one or two more points. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Maybe, you know what, as things get better, they also have to get worse. You need to have a balance around. Look, I'll probably talk more about Gog and Magog next week because I feel like I want to just segue into it. And there's no doubt that before it gets completely better, the prophets do tell us that there is going to be some kind of war. I will tell you though, the Rebbe did not say this definitively, but he said he hoped that all the wars of the past century fulfilled the prophecies of Gog and Magog. That he said he hoped we wouldn't have the actual wars that are prophesied about Gog and Magog, about wars in the world before Mashiach comes. And as you can see that there's plenty of wars that are still happening, maybe that's Gog and Magog, we don't know. But we did mention these prophecies, right? They sound fantastical, whether it's the elimination of illness, disease, famine, poverty, war, all that. As fantastical as it sounds, as unrealistic as these prophecies look, especially when you turn on the news, as I did driving here this morning, we can imagine how outlandish they must have sounded when they were first proclaimed millennia ago, when we were in a vastly different world, when the world knew of war. That was the way it is. But we're now in a position to see that while many problems still remain, while there's still all those issues, but there is a lot to celebrate, at least in the progress and improvements that have happened. That's really the point. And that's the, I don't pretend to only see the good in the world. I hope I've made that clear. Right? We know that there's problems, but let's just look at these numbers. When we go back to a slide like this, and you see the decline in the world of murders, of crime, and regardless of the accuracy of the numbers, the decline in poverty, then I think you see that there's progress. There's lots of progress. There's more progress to be made. Mashiach will solve that. Right? But it's important to realize the redemption is yet to materialize. It hasn't happened yet. So I'm not trying to prove that we live in an idealistic world, but this doesn't negate the point I am trying to prove. Right? We could see that we are progressing towards an era of no violence. Not there yet. We are improving all the situations. Right? We're on the right track, and that's the point I'm trying to say. You know that during COVID, during the pandemic, we've learned to properly assess the situation. We can't focus too heavily on data from a single day because, were you checking your phone? I was. And at the beginning of the lockdown, we felt safe here in South Africa. And then remember how the situation just changed like that? So for a more accurate read of a situation, we need to zoom out. We need to look. We used to look at the 7 days. Remember when they would tell us, when are we going to go from stage 5 lockdown to stage 4? Only when they see, I don't know, I think they wanted 2 weeks of the numbers dropping, or 30 days, or whatever it was, right? Rolling averages. You can't just look at the statistical anomalies of. So, yet many people are oblivious to many of the amazing things that we discussed. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that just look at the progress. Look at how things are improving. Don't just see the doom and gloom. Don't just see the problems, because there are improvements. We are progressing. Now, of course, you could ask, how is it possible that there's many areas that are worse today than we ever were, if you like to point the dark picture? So how are we getting closer to Mashiach if things are getting worse? So for starters, first of all, there are opinions in the Gemara that tell us that things will get worse before they get better. But it's also possible to see the negatives themselves as prerequisites for redemption. The prophet Daniel, as an example, discusses the end of days. It says, many will be purged, purified, and refined. Okay? In order for evil to be purged, in order for the good, for the world to be refined, it has to come. Maybe these are some of the ways it comes about. I don't know. I'm not professing to have the answers to everything. But I just wanted to point out that things are getting better. And while those who were saying last week poverty is getting worse, I did see an article that says that global extreme poverty is expected to rise. So those statistics that I showed you the other day, with 90% of the world out of extreme poverty, the current economy is making it worse. And maybe it is worse now than it was before. But I do think the solutions to these situations are certainly at hand. Okay, let's do a little activity before we conclude today's shiur. Okay. Here we are. Anyone know what do you see here? Huh? What's the most noticeable aspect on this slide that I just showed you? The missing tile. Very good. You know that there's a syndrome, okay? It's called the missing tile syndrome. Have you heard of it? The missing tile takes up a very small percentage of what you're looking at on the screen. Why was your eye drawn to that? Because that's part of the human condition. We focus on what sticks out instead of what is in its place. So we take the good for granted because it's the norm, and instead we focus on what's wrong around us. We see in the news and the media this terror, this crime, this corruption, this disease, this problems. Why? Because it's not the norm. And maybe there's also a lot of information around us, and our brains cannot handle it all, right? So we prioritize to take in what we want, what we're drawn to, and ignore other stuff. So given the human need for survival, our brain sorts through all of this information and looks for what might be a threat. And what we see as a threat, negative stories, that becomes the focus. In the media, they call it, if it bleeds, it leads. So there's certainly that idea that exists. And I want to actually conclude with a video about that, a TED Talk that discusses this. Let me just see if I could find that for you. Give me a moment. Yeah? Yeah.
The Rebbe said that we have done everything we need to do to bring Mashiach.
Yeah.
And we need to now focus on mitzvahs and good deeds. So you heard what you heard from Rabbi Kivan, and not setting the projections. But I want to challenge you, because I challenged myself I've done hard on myself. But I went home and I thought, I'm saying something, yes, I'm saying, but words are cheap. We could all say 1,000 words if we wish. Words are cheap.
Yeah.
And I asked myself that it was over several days, because I was very disturbed. What am I doing about the situation? It's all very well to use words, to say things are bad, poverty is increasing, crime is increasing, etc., etc. But what am I personally doing to fulfill the Rebbe's instruction, one more mitzvah? What am I doing to help my fellow countrymen overcome the hardships that they're suffering? A lot because of COVID, a lot because of crime, corruption, etc. So I extend to you the same challenge. You heard what you heard. What are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Shkaya. Yes. I want to do a little exercise as well before we conclude, and I will put on that video to conclude with a TED Talk that I think you'll find quite fascinating. And thank you for those encouraging words, because we each have to ask ourselves, what are we doing, right? But let me ask you, if you have a paper in front of you, fold it in half, and then fold it again, and again, and again, until you can't do it anymore, okay? How many times do you think you could fold it? Over and over and over. There's obviously a limit, right? Let me ask you, if you folded it 20 times, how tall would it be? Huh? Maybe it would be taller than Mount Everest. No? Maybe it could reach higher than the moon. Each time we fold the paper, we add only one fold, right? But we double the paper's size, right? After a few folds, you could have a whole exponential, something huge.
You don't understand. The people on Zoom and YouTube, there are lots, have been writing
if you give
to say that it is ridiculous
100
that
rand each day
to this woman
for 20
who
days,
keeps talking. She
much will you
doesn't
end
give
up
him a
with?
chance. Whatever he says, she's got
2,000.
another view.
But if I give you
Now,
1 rand
she around yesterday and said
today,
it's not happening anymore.
and double the amount I give you each day for
or
20
maybe
days,
the day
how much will
before.
you get?
And one would have thought that she got the message.
I don't know, some
She
huge
has
number,
not-
okay?
She has
So which would you rather?
reduced it by one, maybe two.
No brainer.
But she
That's
still
called
continues with
exponential
her
growth.
rubbish. And it's because of her
And there's
that
a lot to
it
talk
will
about this
last
whole
so
thing of
long.
exponential growth.
Because
But the
he
point
panders
is
to her. He says,
that I think today,
I'm not
in the
saying
last
love.
century,
He's trying to prove his point
we've
over
seen
and over.
so much
But he
exponential growth in
she's
so many
very
ways.
clever, and she is.
My grandmother
But
used to
you
tell me in
don't,
her lifetime,
but you
she was
don't
born in 1912. She
interfere
lived, she
with the
saw
rabbi
horse and
doing
buggies
the
moving
talk.
into
And even
cars
though
and the
he's been
advancement and
very nice
development
to
and
her, I
planes
would
and
have told her to get
refrigeration
out.
and running
Because
water and
you
television
don't
and
understand how
electric
you would never
stoves and
that you
computers and
still
iPhones and you name it.
and you can't hear her.
She passed away
Because
in
when she, because
2004.
can't hear him.
iPhone came out in
When I listen to him, I
2007.
do
So the
this.
smartphones are ready.
When she talks, I'm still
The
doing
rate
this,
of
but I
change in
can't
the
hear
last
her.
30 years has been
I
so much
understand,
faster,
but are
actually
you listening
mind-blowing
to
how
what
fast it
I'm
was.
telling you?
30 years ago, there was no
That is
internet.
why he goes on
Remember
forever.
when it started and it was like dial-up and you had to wait an hour and a half to
Yes.
just get on, right? There were no smartphones 15 years ago.
Somehow or other,
There was no social media.
I'm already on, so you can't get
In
in
our
again.
lifetimes, the pace of growth has been unprecedented.
Maybe.
What do they call it? The law of
But you don't know that. You can only
accelerating
do it
returns.
as a trial, and he's not there
Everything that we
tomorrow.
discussed
Some other woman is,
in
and
this
there's nothing
little
on
series
Zoom
that we
tomorrow.
just did
Thursday,
the
there's
past
no
few
meeting.
days about Mashiach,
The only one
leads
who's
us to the
on
conclusion
is
that
Rifki.
we are improving in
At
exponential
one.
ways. We could expect change, positive change, to be even more
Not only
rapid
this, Kim, I got to
and
phone
more
Shoshana.
exciting in the
I want to
coming
just
years.
order two,
And it will
what do you call
continue
it,
to
cakes
accelerate
with
until
apple
we
and
reach the
custard.
pinnacle
And
of the coming of Mashiach. So
did you
we
hear?
looked
I'll
at
buy
the
blintzes,
prophecies,
apple and
we looked
custard.
at these
That's it
ideas, we
for
see
Carol
the
if she
problems in the
comes.
world,
And
we
rolls. I
see
don't know
the
how many rolls. You
improvements,
better tell
but
me
this
because I'm doing
is only the
Shoshana
tip of the
first, and
iceberg.
then I'm doing
We
this,
have a
Kim.
lot more to talk about, and I hope that with time we will talk more.
So
We'll look
12
at
rolls
other
of
aspects
Kitka rolls
of life
and
and
2
growth and
apple and
development and
custard because
change
that's her
and all of
favorite.
the other progress that the
Right.
world has seen.
And then I will
Because
get
so
blintzes
much has
tomorrow
changed.
when I go to the shops or
Looking at
whatever
a
at
few of these changes
what you
that
call
you've
it
experienced
at.
in the past couple of years. Let me see if I can get the video on.
So he's gone away with my thing.
Stop
He'll be
share.
going away with my
Any questions?
thing.
No, you're going to test it today. Just told me,
Yeah, but then
you can't do anything about it. All I want to know is must I throw it away. Because it's not working at all. Doesn't matter what you do. Again, Heidi's running the clock.
must I throw it away because he'll keep it and then one day he'll have it fixed. Get it back. Get it back.
I'll get it back, but I said They're going
Don't say
away
must
on
I
Thursday,
throw
they're
it
coming back
away.
on Tuesday.
That's a
hardly
funny
running
way of
Congress.
putting it.
There's nothing you can do with it as it is. What are
I'm
you
still
going to
on
do
the
with a
program.
I've tried it a million times. It doesn't charge. It's something I think it's totally finished. It's not as though you
Police pepper spray.
Vicious cartels.
Costa Cruise Line.
Societal decay. 65 dead.
Tsunami warning.
Cyber attacks.
Drug war. Mass destruction.
Tornado. Recession. Default.
Doomsday.
Egypt.
Syria.
Crisis. Death. Disaster. Oh my God.
So those are just a few of the clips I collected over the last 6 months. Could have easily been the last 6 days or the last 6 years. The point is that the news media preferentially feeds us negative stories because that's what our minds pay attention to. And there's a very good reason for that. Every second of every day, our senses bring in way too much data that we can possibly process in our brains.